Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and we're going to talk about people who form their identity in the absence of Dungeons and Dragons, specifically in the choice to not play Dungeons and Dragons. We talked so much on this channel about people whose identity are bound up in Dungeons and Dragons. I'm one of these people. But today I want to talk about somebody who is crafting an identity by excluding Dungeons and Dragons. All right, so let's get into this. So I was recently having a conversation with a group of dungeon masters, and it was a really interesting conversation. We started going around, and everybody we were telling war stories, and we got to the point where we started telling our origin story, when we started Dungeons and Dragons. It went around, and there were a few interesting ones. But there was this one person who we got, you got the classics. You're like, oh, I grew up in the satanic panic and I couldn't play. And Dungeons and Dragons is part of my identity because I had to sacrifice to play it, right? And you're like, yeah, I get that. Like, you sacrificed. This became part of your identity because there was a period where you were persecuted, right? And it is interesting because in America, many of us do not, many Americans never see persecution. We have so much freedom here that many Americans do not see persecution. Which is really unusual because in a lot of other countries, persecution comes like they have the Baskin Robbins 32 flavors of persecution, right? And in America, there is absolutely persecution in America, but it's far rarer than any other country in the world, just because we're more tolerant, right? And freedom allows us so many options, and we can move in so many directions, and we can find communities who are like us because freedom and liberty has literally shaped this special nation where prejudice is lower than I would say most other nations of the world, right? So, but there are a lot of dungeon masters who really like that they went through the satanic panic because they had this period of persecution. It's real, and it's kind of a badge of honor in America. Not everyone could say I was persecuted in America, right? And Americans give value to, if you have that badge, other Americans will recognize it and say, hey, I'm sorry that happened to you. And there's some currency there, right? Like, persecution is a currency. I think that's the future too, by the way, if you ain't paying attention. Money is for schmucks now, right? Yeah, okay, I see your money, but do you have celebrity? That's a more powerful currency, right? Do you have attention? That's a currency. Persecution? That's a currency, right? We are choosing new currencies as we kind of build this new world. But one of them said, I couldn't play Dungeons and Dragons because when I found it, I was abroad, and I really couldn't get access to enough books and enough players. And so I found Dungeons and Dragons, but I couldn't play it, and I could only play it when I returned to the States. And I was like, wait, and then that dungeon master said something. I think there are these bells of clarity that ring, and he said, what I missed out on formed my identity, right? Dungeons and Dragons became really powerful and valuable to me because it's something I couldn't have, right? And the moment he said it, I was like, holy cows, people who are building identities based on what they can't have, right? And then another key clicked, right? And this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about Chads. So you and I are, if you listen to this channel, you deep in the weeds, baby. If you fool yourself, don't fool yourself anymore. You deep in the weeds on Dungeons and Dragons, you listen to this channel. My identity, no question, is bound up in Dungeons and Dragons. This is not even a, Dungeons and Dragons is a huge part of my identity. That, it's just the way it is. But there's this new group, Chads, right? And I'd say it's in terms about 5 years old, right? What is a Chad? It's someone who dates as much as they want and maybe even more than they want, right? A Chad is a very recognized cultural theme in America. It is a type of person. A Chad pulls, right? They're like, I'm going to date a lot, I'm going to date as much as I want, I might even date more than I want, right? And there's a lot of attention on Chads now, and the reason why is I've been paying a lot of attention to Pearl Davis. She's a subject matter expert on modern dating, and she is saying that 80% of women, you could throw these numbers around a little bit, but the theme is the same. 80% of women are seeking 20% of all men, and that increasingly huge tracts of men either don't date or never will date, or their dating is going to be so limited that it's essentially non-functional. But there's 20% of all men who are dating voluminously, right? And what's really interesting is I think Chads definitely use Dungeons and Dragons. And the way they use it is they're like, I don't do that nerd stuff. And it's a projection, right? They don't board game. They don't tabletop role-playing game. They don't do that nerd stuff. Chads are, you'll see a Chad, right? Like, it's raining. The Chad will be walking home from work with no umbrella. They make very careful choices to project an image which allows them to have this one thing that Chads have. Chads date as much as they want, or even more than they want, right? And many of them are, there's no monogamy for Chads, right? They're polygamous, right? They have amorous relationships in 50 directions, and that's not even an exaggeration, right? And in order to get there, one of the things they do is I think they use Dungeons and Dragons to be like, anytime there would be an invitation to a Chad to sit at a Dungeons and Dragons, they're like, I can't do that. I got a reputation to uphold, right? And Dungeons and Dragons, like it or lump it, we are still considered nerd stuff. That is, I think we thought for a minute that we had progressed beyond it. We have not, all right? And so I think, so we have talked a lot about people who use Dungeons and Dragons to shape their identity. But be aware, there are groups of people who are using Dungeons and Dragons and saying, I will never touch that with a 10-foot pole, no pun intended, because I want to form my identity as the absence of Dungeons and Dragons. I don't do that nerd stuff. And I will say, more than anything in the world, Dungeons and Dragons is synonymous with nerd stuff. So if you're a Chad, you're not going to play Dungeons and Dragons generally, okay? And then, or you might play, but you might not tell anybody, right? The other thing is when you make invitations, realize Chads aren't going to come anywhere near your Dungeons and Dragons campaign, right? And so we should be aware of that, right? And also we should also be aware that this freight is still attached to Dungeons and Dragons, right? And I think it definitely is. Well, that's my humble opinion. I'm ready to hear yours. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider subscribing and have a wonderful millennium.